Today we're going to read A Long Walk to Water, chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 6, Southern Sudan, 2008. Naya's family had been coming to the lake camp for generations. Naya herself had been there every year since she was born. One thing she liked about the camp was that even though she had to dig in the clay and wait for the water, she did not have to make the 2 long trips to the pond every day. But this year she realized for the first time that her mother hated camp. They had no house and had to sleep in makeshift shelters. They could not bring most of their things, so they had to make do with whatever was at hand. And for much of each day, they had to dig for water. But the worst was the look on her mother's face when Naya's father and older brother Depp went off to hunt. Fear. Her mother was afraid of that the men in the family would run into Dinka tribesmen somewhere, that they would fight and get injured, or worse. They had been lucky all these years. No one from Naya's family had been hurt or killed by Dinka, but she knew other families in the village who had lost loved ones in this way. Naya could see the questions on her mother's face every morning. Would they be lucky again? Or was it now their turn to lose someone? Southern Sudan, 1985. Salva's mouth closed and opened again, as if he were a fish. He tried to speak, but no sound came out of his throat. He tried to move, but his feet seemed stuck to the ground. "Salva!" the man said again and hurried towards him. When the man was only a few steps away, Salva suddenly found his voice. "Uncle!" he cried out and ran into the man's arms. Uncle Juir was the youngest brother of Salva's father. Salva hadn't seen him in at least 2 years because Uncle had been in the army. Uncle must have known about the war and the fighting. Maybe he will know where my family is. But those hopes were dashed as soon as Uncle spoke. "Are you alone? Where's your family?" he asked. Salva hardly knew where to begin to answer. It seemed like years since he had run away from his school and into the bush. But he told his uncle everything as best he could. As Salva spoke, Uncle nodded or shook his head. His face became very solemn when Salva told him that he had not seen nor heard a single word of his family in all this time. Salva's voice trailed off and he lowered his head. He was glad to see Uncle again, but it looked as if he might not be much help either. Uncle was quiet for a moment. Then he pat Salva's shoulder. Nephew," he said in a cheerful voice, "we are together now, so I will look after you." It turned out that Uncle had joined the group 3 days earlier, but since there were more than 30 people traveling together, they had not found each other until now. As they had been walking, Salva saw that Uncle had a gun, a rifle, that he carried on a strap over one shoulder. Already Salva could tell that because of his army experience and because he had a gun, Uncle was seen by the group as a kind of leader. "Yes, when I left the army, they let me keep my rifle," Uncle said, "so I'm going to shoot us a fine meal as soon as we come across anything worth eating." Uncle was true to his word. That very day he shot a young antelope, the kind called a topi. Salva could hardly wait for it to be skinned and butchered and roasted. As the smoky meat aroma filled the air, he had to keep swallowing the saliva that flooded into his mouth. Uncle laughed as he watched Salva gobble down his first piece of meat. "Salva, you have teeth. You are supposed to use them when you eat." Salva could not reply. He was too busy stuffing another chunk of the delicious charred meat into his mouth. Even though the topi was a small one, there was more than enough meat for everyone in the group. But it did not take long for Salva to regret his haste in eating. After so many weeks of near starvation, his stomach rebelled mightily. He spent most of the night vomiting. Salva was not alone. When his heaving stomach woke him, he would hurry to the edge of camp to vomit and find others doing the same. At one point, Salva found himself in a line of a half-dozen people, all in identical poses, bent over, holding their stomachs and waiting for the next wave of nausea. It might have been funny if he hadn't felt so miserable. The group continued to walk through the land of the Aturt. Every day they saw lions, usually resting in the shade of small trees. Once in the distance they saw a lion chasing a topi. The topi escaped, but along the path Salva saw the bones of prey that had not been so fortunate. Salva and Mario still walked together, staying close to Uncle. Sometimes Uncle would talk with the other men, talk seriously about the journey. At those times, Salva and Mario would drop back respectfully, but Salva always tried to keep Uncle in sight, and he slept near Uncle at night. One day, the group began walking in the late afternoon with hopes of reaching a water hole before settling down for the night. But there was no water anywhere. Although they searched for miles, they kept walking into the night and through the night. For 10 hours they walked, and by dawn, everyone was exhausted. Uncle and the other leaders finally decided that the group had to rest. Salva took 2 steps off the path and fell asleep almost before he lay down. He did not wake until he felt Uncle's hand shaking his shoulder. He opened his eyes and heard wailing. Someone was crying. Salva blinked away the sleepiness and looked at Uncle, whose face was very solemn. "I'm sorry, Salva," Uncle said quietly. "Your friend, Mariel?" Salva looked around. "He should be somewhere nearby. I don't remember if he slept near me. I was so tired. Perhaps he has gone to find something to eat." Uncle stroked Salva's head as if he were a baby. "I am sorry," he said again. A cold fist seemed to grip Salva's heart. Chapter 7, Southern Sudan, 2008. Naya sat on the floor. She reached out and took her little sister's hand. Akir did not seem to notice. She lay curled on her side, hardly moving, silent except for an occasional whimper. Her silence frightened Naya. Only 2 days earlier, Akir had complained noisily and at length about the pains in her stomach. Naya had been annoyed by all the whining. Now she felt guilty, for she could see that her sister was no longer had strength to complain. Naya knew many people who suffered from the same illness, first cramps and stomachache, then diarrhea. Sometimes fever too. Most of the adults and older children who fell ill recovered at least enough to work again, although they might continue to suffer on and off for years. For the elderly and for small children, the illness could be dangerous. Unable to hold anything in their stomachs, many of them starved to death, even with food right in front of them. Naya's uncle, the chief in the village, knew of a medical clinic a few days' walk away. He told Naya's family that if they could take Akir there, the doctors would give her medicine to make her help her get better. But a trip like that would be very difficult for Akir. Should they stay at the camp and let her rest so she might heal on her own? Or should they begin the long, hard walk and hope they reached help in time? Southern Sudan, 1985. Walking began again. Salva shook with terror inside and out. He clung to his uncle like a baby or a little boy, hanging on to his hand or shirt tail whenever he could, never letting Uncle get farther than an arm's length away. He looked around constantly. Every movement in the grass was a lion stalking. Every stillness, a lion waiting to spring. Mariel was gone, vanished into the night. He would have never wandered away from the group on his own. His disappearance could only mean one thing: lion. A lion had been hungry enough to approach the group as they slept. A few men had been keeping watch, but in the dark night, with the wind rippling through the long grass, the lion could easily have crept close without being seen. And it sought out prey that was small and motionless, Mariel sleeping. And it had taken him away, leaving only a few splotches of blood near the path. If it hadn't been for Uncle, Salva might have gone crazy with fear. Uncle spoke to him all morning in a steady, low voice. "Salva, I have a gun. It will shoot any lion that comes near. Salva, I will stay awake tonight and keep watch. Salva, we will soon be out of lion country. Everything will be okay." Listening to Uncle, hurrying to stay close to him, Salva was able to make his feet move despite the cold terror throughout his whole body. But nothing was all right. He had lost his family, and now he had lost his friends as well. No one had heard any screaming in the night. Salva hoped with all his heart that the lion had killed Mariel instantly, that his friend hadn't had time to feel fear or pain. The landscape grew greener. The air smelled of water. "The Nile," Uncle said. "We will soon come to the Nile River and cross to the other side." The Nile, the longest river in the world, the mother of all life in Sudan. Uncle explained that they would come to the river at one of its broadest stretches. "It will not even look like a river. It will look like a big lake. We will spend a long time crossing to the other side." "And what's on the other side?" Salva whispered, still fearful. "Desert," Uncle explained. "And after that, Ethiopia." Salva's eyes filled with tears. Mariel had been right about Ethiopia. How I wish he were here so I could tell him I was wrong. Selva stood on the bank of the Nile. Here, as Uncle had said, the river formed a big lake. The group would cross the Nile in boats, Uncle said. It would take a whole day to reach the island in the middle of the lake and another day to get to the far shore. Selva frowned. He saw no boats anywhere. Uncle smiled at Selva's puzzled expression. What, you didn't bring your own boat? Then he said, I hope you are a good swimmer. Selva lowered his head. He knew that Uncle was teasing, but he felt so tired of worrying about his family, tired of thinking about poor Mario, tired of walking and not knowing where they were going. The least Uncle could do was tell him the truth about the boats. Uncle put his arm around Selva's shoulder. You'll see, we have a lot of work to do. Selva staggered forward with yet another enormous load of reeds in his arms. Everyone was busy. Some people were cutting down the tall papyrus grass by the water's edge. Others, like Selva, gathered up the cut stalks and took them to the boat builders. Among the group were a few people whose home villages had been near rivers or lakes. They knew how to tie the reeds together and weave them cleverly to form shallow canoes. Everyone worked quickly, although there is no way of knowing whether they had to hurry or not, no way of knowing how near the war was. The fighting could be miles away, or a plane carrying bombs could fly overhead at any moment. It was hard work running back and forth between those cutting and those weaving, but Selva found that the work was helping him feel a little better. He was too busy to worry much. Doing something, even carrying big, awkward piles of slippery reeds, was better than doing nothing. Every time Selva delivered a load of reeds, he would pause for a few moments and admire the skills of the boat builders. The long reeds were laid out in neat bunches. At each end of the bunch would be tied together tightly. Then the bunch of reeds was pulled apart in the middle to form a hollow, and the two sides were tied all along their length to make a basic boat shape. More layers of reeds were added to make the bottom of the boat. Selva watched fascinated, as little by little the curve of a prow and low sides grew from the piles of reeds. It took 2 full days for the group to build enough canoes. Each canoe was tested. A few did not float well and had to be fixed. Then more reeds were tied together to form paddles. At last, everything was ready. Selva got into a canoe between Uncle and another man. He gripped the sides of the boat tightly as it floated out into the Nile.